Our stick figure wakes up. He is a simple drawing, just a circle for a head and four thin lines for limbs. But the way he holds his head in both hands tells you everything you need to know. It is 7 in the morning. He has a splitting headache. He sits on the edge of his stick figure bed with his stick figure shoulders slumped and his stick figure face pulled into a miserable frown, and for a long moment he just sits there feeling sorry for himself. Then he stands up. He shuffles to the bathroom. He opens the medicine cabinet. He takes out a small orange bottle, shakes two little white pills into his palm, swallows them with a gulp of water, and shuffles back to the kitchen to make coffee. Total time? Maybe 45 seconds. Total difficulty? Nearly zero. He leans against the counter while the coffee brews, and something about the ease of it makes him pause. He looks down at his hand. He looks at the spot on the counter where the bottle now sits. He thinks about those two small pills. And for the first time in his life, really for the very first time, he wonders where they came from. Not the pharmacy. Before the pharmacy. Before the factory that made them. Before the chemist who formulated them. Before the researcher who tested them. Before all of it. Where did the idea even come from? The idea that a headache was something a person could fix, that pain was a problem with a solution. He stares at the pill bottle. The coffee maker beeps. And that question, that small, quiet question, opens up into something enormous. Because here is what our stick figure does not know yet. He does not know that those two pills are the direct descendants of a discovery made thousands of years ago by someone who had no lab, no chemistry degree, no pill press, no pharmacy. He does not know that the knowledge that produced them traveled across 100 generations, passed from one pair of hands to another, held in memory and in bark and in clay tablet and in whispered instruction before it ever reached a bottle with a childproof cap. He does not know that the chain between himself and the person who first made this discovery is long and painful and extraordinary, and that every single link in that chain was forged by someone who had almost nothing to work with. He is about to find out. He sets down his coffee. He sits at his kitchen table. His stick figure eyes get that particular far-off look that means his brain has decided this is more interesting than breakfast, and the story begins. Imagine our stick figure thinks, waking up with this same headache 50,000 years ago, no pills, no pharmacy, no doctor, no internet, just you, the pain, and a cave full of people who are equally clueless about what is happening inside your skull. He tries to picture it. He draws himself, in his imagination, as a prehistoric stick figure. Same circle head, same four lines, but now there is a cave behind him, and firelight, and a dark forest beyond, and the sounds of things moving in that darkness that he does not want to think about too hard. What would prehistoric stick figure do? Rest. That is the honest answer. Lie down, stay quiet, wait it out, and that is not nothing. That is, in fact, biology being correct. Our bodies have built-in responses to pain and illness, behavioral defaults that stretch back millions of years. Rest, seek warmth, avoid food when the stomach rebels, lick wounds. These instincts are not random. They are the product of evolutionary selection so old it predates humanity itself. Our stick figure thinks about his dog, who after surgery curled up in a corner and refused to move for 2 days and recovered beautifully. That behavior is ancient. That behavior works. But ancient stick figure, crouching by the fire with his throbbing head, starts to do something that sets his kind apart from every other creature on the planet. He starts to watch. He has been watching things his whole life. Because watching things is how you survive when you have no claws and no armor and no significant speed. He watches which animals go to which plants when they are sick. He watches a small creature press itself against a particular root after being stung. He watches the way the old healer of his group, a small, hunched stick figure with a circle full of wrinkles for a face, goes directly to certain leaves when someone's wound is infected, and how those wounds sometimes close up clean while the untreated ones do not. Ancient stick figure does not have a word for observation. He does not have a word for medicine. But he has eyes, and he has memory, and he has the ability to tell someone else what he noticed. That last part is the crucial thing. Watch a dog, find a medicinal plant, and you have a dog with useful behavior. Watch ancient stick figure, find the same plant, and then describe it to every other stick figure around the fire that night, and you have the beginning of a medical tradition. One observation, shared at the right moment, can save dozens of lives across the next generation. And those people share it with the generation after that. And on, across thousands of years, across thousands of miles, until a body of knowledge exists that no single person ever created but that everyone benefits from. Our stick figure leans forward over his kitchen table. That is the origin of medicine, he realizes. Not an invention, not a discovery, an accumulation. A slow, painful, brilliant accumulation of things that worked, noticed by people who had no idea why they worked, passed down by people who understood only that they did. He imagines ancient stick figure in the forest, watching a chimpanzee. This is a scene researchers have actually documented. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, deliberately seek out specific plants when they are sick. Plants they do not normally eat, plants they clearly do not enjoy eating. They swallow rough leaves that physically scrape parasites from their intestinal walls. They chew bitter bark from trees that contain compounds toxic to the exact parasites affecting them. They are not doing this for pleasure. They are doing it because it works. And at some point in our evolutionary history, a hominid ancestor watched this behavior and did the same thing, and felt better, and told someone. Ancient stick figure, sitting by the fire with his willow bark in his hand, does not know the word salicin. He does not know about cyclooxygenase enzymes or prostaglandins or the biochemical cascade of inflammation. He knows only that the inside of his bark, chewed into a paste and held against the ache, makes the ache smaller. That is enough. That is, in fact, exactly enough. Our stick figure at the kitchen table picks up his coffee cup and holds it with both hands. The coffee is warm. He thinks about the word empirical. He learned it in school, in a science class, and he thinks it means something dry and academic. But it does not. It means something much older and more alive than that. It means try it, watch what happens, keep what works, discard what does not. It means every single one of our stick figure ancestors, sitting by their fires across 50,000 years, doing science with their eyes and their memories and their willingness to try again tomorrow. Now the story takes our stick figure somewhere that will genuinely surprise him. It surprises him so much that his stick figure jaw, in a neat visual trick, literally drops all the way to his stick figure chest, which is the kind of thing that only happens in animation and yet somehow perfectly captures the feeling. In the year 2023, researchers working in a cave in Borneo found a skeleton. This skeleton was approximately 31,000 years old. And this skeleton was missing part of its left leg, not because it had been lost over time, because it had been surgically removed. The cut was clean. The bone had regrown around the wound. The patient did not just survive the surgery, they survived it well enough to live for years afterward. Our stick figure stares at nothing for a long moment. 31,000 years ago. He imagines an ancient healer stick figure, looking at a patient stick figure whose leg has been badly damaged, perhaps in a fall. Perhaps in an encounter with something large and hungry. The healer looks at the wound. The healer looks at the leg. The healer makes a decision that requires a kind of courage that our modern stick figure finds almost incomprehensible. They decide to cut the leg off, with stone tools, in a cave. Without anesthesia as we understand it, without antiseptic as we understand it, without a single piece of equipment that a modern surgical suite would recognize, and the patient lives. Not just for an hour, not just for a day, for years, in a jungle, on one leg, in the Stone Age. Before that discovery, archaeologists believed organized surgery was a few thousand years old at most. Now the timeline had been shoved back to the Ice Age, and nobody knew quite how to process that. Because it did not just mean that ancient people were performing surgery. It meant they had figured out how to do it successfully, which implies practice, which implies knowledge, which implies a tradition of accumulated surgical technique being passed from one healer to the next across generations we cannot even imagine. Our modern stick figure stands up from the table and starts pacing. His little stick figure legs move back and forth across his kitchen floor, and his circle head is tilted slightly downward, which, in the visual language of stick figures, means deep thought. And then he thinks about the skulls. Across archaeological sites on every populated continent, researchers have found human skulls with neat holes in them. Not holes from violence, holes from surgery. The procedure is called trepanation, and it involves removing a section of the skull, presumably to relieve pressure, to treat seizures, to address a head injury, to do something for someone whose brain was in trouble. The wild part, the part that makes our stick figure stop pacing and stand completely still, is what happened next. A significant number of the patients survived. The bone grew back around the holes. People had brain surgery in the Stone Age, with stone tools, and many of them walked away from it. How? How did those surgeons know to do that? How did they know it would help? How did they learn the technique without killing every patient? Our modern stick figure does not know the answer. Nobody does. What we do know is that trepanation became common enough across multiple unconnected cultures on different continents to be called widespread. It worked often enough to be worth repeating. And that, in its own deeply strange way, is remarkable. Our stick figure stops at the window and looks outside. He is thinking about knowledge, about how knowledge works, about how every time an ancient healer tried something and it worked, and then told someone, and that someone told someone else, a thread was created. And those threads wove together into something that could carry understanding across distances and decades and centuries. He is thinking about what it would mean to be the person who held those threads, who was the living repository of everything your community had learned about staying alive. Because here is the thing that does not get talked about enough. Those people, the healers and the shamans and the midwives and the herbalists, they were not primitive. They were not guessing randomly in the dark. They were specialists. They had dedicated their lives to a body of knowledge that had been tested on real human bodies across hundreds of years, and they understood things that no one else in the community understood. Losing that person to disease or violence was not just losing a neighbor. It was losing the library. It was losing accumulated knowledge that could take generations to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. Knowledge was medicine, and medicine was survival. Our stick figure makes himself another cup of coffee, which in stick figure terms means he holds a little square-shaped machine under a small pot and a line of dots falls from the pot into the square, which is the only way to draw coffee being made when you are working with circles and lines. He sits back down, and now the story moves forward in time, and the scene around him shifts. Ancient Egypt, 3,500 years ago. Our stick figure imagines himself walking through a scene of dry heat and flat land and a river and enormous buildings in the background that look, in stick figure animation, like simple triangles stacked against a white sky. In the middle of this scene, a healer stick figure is grinding something in a small stone bowl. The grinding stick figure has very deliberate movements, careful and precise, and next to them is a rolled piece of papyrus, covered in tiny marks. That papyrus is real. It is called the Ebers Papyrus, written around 3,500 years ago, but containing knowledge much older than that. And it lists over 700 remedies using hundreds of plants, minerals, and animal preparations. 700. For a civilization that did not know what a bacterium was, that is a genuinely astonishing pharmacopoeia. And some of it works. Not because the Egyptians understood the mechanism, but because they had noticed, through direct empirical observation across centuries, that certain things produced certain results. The healer grinds honey into a wound dressing. Honey is a real antimicrobial agent. Its low moisture content and acidic chemistry and natural hydrogen peroxide production create an environment where bacteria cannot easily survive. The Egyptians did not know any of that. They knew that wounds treated with honey healed better. That was enough. The healer reaches for garlic. Garlic has real antibacterial and antifungal properties. Workers building the enormous triangles in the background consumed garlic in enormous quantities, and the Egyptians prescribed it for infections, and they were accidentally doing the right thing. The healer reaches for willow bark, for aloe, for the dried seed pods of the opium poppy, which work for pain relief because of receptors in the human brain that nobody knew existed for another few thousand years. These were not lucky guesses. Our stick figure leans forward over his kitchen table, returning to his own time and his own kitchen for a moment. These were not flukes. These were the end products of thousands of years of careful, deliberate, accumulated observation. Nobody knew why these things worked, but they knew they worked, and they considered that knowledge precious enough to write down and preserve and pass on. They turned accumulated observation into recorded knowledge, and that was a transformation that changed everything. The scene shifts again. Our stick figure is now watching a different healer, this one in a setting that looks like Greece, with simple white columns drawn in the background and a blue shape that represents the sea. This healer has a patient, lying on a simple bench, a patient stick figure with their leg bent at a bad angle, and the healer is doing something methodical and careful with cloth and straight sticks. Setting a broken bone, immobilizing the fracture so the bone can knit back together. This is where ancient medicine gets its clearest wins. Broken bones heal on their own if kept still and supported. The archaeological record shows ancient humans had been doing exactly this for as long as we can see clearly. Egyptian mummies with healed fractures show evidence of splinting. Greek texts describe fracture management in remarkable detail. Roman surgical instruments excavated from sites across Europe are, in many cases, recognizably similar to tools surgeons used in the 19th century. Battlefield medicine in particular drove enormous advances because keeping soldiers alive was a practical military necessity. The Roman army had trained field medics, had organized field hospitals, had surgeons who specialized in exactly the grim work of keeping bodies functional after violence had been done to them. That Roman surgeon stick figure is working now in our story, and our modern stick figure watches with something between admiration and discomfort. Because the Roman surgeon does not have antiseptics in the modern sense, does not have general anesthesia, does not have the things that make modern surgery a relatively safe proposition rather than a terrifying gamble. And yet, working within those limits, the Roman surgeon does things that would remain the standard of trauma care for over 1,000 years after the empire fell. Not because ancient people were somehow heroic in a way modern people are not, but because they were doing what humans do. They were learning and practicing and refining and passing on what they learned. Our stick figure stands up from the table again. He walks to the window. He is thinking about something that is starting to feel very large in his mind, something he wants to articulate but keeps circling around. He looks at the orange pill bottle still sitting on the counter. He thinks about every step between that bottle and the willow bark in the ancient healer's hand. And then he thinks about a gap, a massive, consequential, civilization-altering gap in understanding that existed right in the middle of all this remarkable accumulated knowledge. Nobody knew what actually caused disease. Not until the 1860s. Not until Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch established germ theory. Not until the mid-19th century did any human being, anywhere on Earth, understand that infectious disease was caused by microscopic organisms. That means every medical tradition that existed before that time, every healer and physician and surgeon and herbalist across all of recorded human history, was operating without the single most fundamental piece of information needed to make sense of what they were seeing. They were doing the right things, sometimes, and they had no idea why those things were right. They were doing the wrong things, sometimes catastrophically, and they had no idea why those things were wrong. The Greek healer stick figure in our story is doing something now that makes our modern stick figure wince. The Greek healer believes disease comes from imbalances in 4 bodily humors, and so the treatment for a sick patient involves deliberately draining blood from them, bloodletting. It remained standard medical practice for over 2,000 years and almost certainly killed more people than it ever helped. The model was completely wrong. The treatment was harmful. And the healer doing it was intelligent, trained, well-intentioned, and operating within the best theoretical framework available to them. That is the hardest thing to sit with. Not that ancient medicine was primitive, but that it was sophisticated, thoughtful, and systematically wrong in ways that nobody could see from inside the framework. And yet, our stick figure is pacing again, because this is the part that keeps stopping him in his tracks. Even with the wrong theory, sometimes the treatment was right. Not by accident exactly, but through that relentless, empirical process, that stubborn willingness to keep trying things and keep what worked and discard what did not. Ancient Egyptian healers applied preparations containing mold to infected wounds, mold that produces penicillin. They were using primitive antibiotics 2,000 years before Alexander Fleming noticed the same effect in a London laboratory and received a Nobel Prize for the discovery. The model was wrong. The result was right. And that distinction matters enormously because it means the gap between ancient medicine and modern medicine is not a gap in the quality of human thinking. It is a gap in the tools available and the accumulated knowledge base and the extraordinary privilege of knowing what a bacterium is. Our stick figure stops pacing. He sits back down. He puts his hands flat on the kitchen table and looks at them for a moment. Sharon is 73 years old. She is a retired waitress from Missouri, and she has neuropathy in her hands and feet, a condition that makes her fingers tingle and burn in ways that no one who has not experienced it can quite imagine. Every morning she wakes up, and the first sensation she registers is that electric buzzing in her extremities. She has lived with it for 6 years. She takes medication for it, medication that was developed through decades of research, tested in trials, refined in labs, approved through regulatory processes that did not exist for the vast majority of human history. And every morning before she takes that medication, she rubs a particular preparation into her hands, a preparation based on capsaicin, the compound that makes peppers hot, which traditional healers in indigenous communities in the Americas discovered centuries ago, and which modern medicine eventually caught up to and confirmed. Every morning, without knowing it, Sharon stands at the intersection of two knowledge systems that are both older than anything we usually think about before coffee. Our stick figure thinks about Sharon, and he thinks about the healer stick figure in the cave, and he thinks about the chain between them, about how knowledge travels. About how a Neanderthal in a cave 60,000 years ago was observed consuming plants with medicinal properties, evidence found not in any written record but in fossilized dental plaque, in the actual chemistry of what remained in those ancient teeth. About how those same plants are still used in traditional medicine today. About how, somewhere between that cave and Sharon's kitchen in Missouri, an understanding traveled slowly through catastrophe and loss, and the occasional brilliant accidental discovery, through wars and plagues and the burning of libraries and the deaths of individual healers who took irreplaceable knowledge with them. And also through the countless quiet moments when one healer pressed a student's hand around a specific root and said, "This one, for this, at this time." Our stick figure imagines those moments. He can see them clearly now. An old healer stick figure in a cave, hunched over a stone mortar, grinding medicinal plants into powder while a younger stick figure watches. The old healer does not have words for what they are teaching. They show, they demonstrate, they let the student smell the plant, taste it cautiously, watch what happens when it is applied. They are transmitting something that took 100 generations to accumulate, and they are transmitting it in the only way available to them. Directly, patiently, hand to hand. He imagines the same scene in an Egyptian courtyard, in a Greek medical school, in a Roman military camp, in a Chinese apothecary, in a laboratory in 17th century Europe, where a physician is slowly figuring out that the foxglove plant, which folk healers in Britain had been using for heart conditions for centuries, contains something that genuinely helps failing hearts. The physician's name is William Withering. He formalized the treatment in 1785, but the treatment was not his invention. He took what the folk healers already knew and asked why it worked. The what had been traveling for centuries. The why was what he was able to add. Our stick figure is not pacing anymore. He is very still. He has the look, in stick figure terms, of someone who has just understood something they cannot ununderstand. The pills in that orange bottle on his counter came from willow bark, chemically similar to salicin, the compound in the bark that Neanderthals were chewing in caves 60,000 years ago, that ancient Egyptian healers were prescribing 3,500 years ago, that medieval Europeans were using throughout the Middle Ages. Nobody spent 50,000 years doing the wrong thing. They spent 50,000 years doing the right thing without knowing why it was right. And then, eventually, someone found out why. And that knowledge, the mechanism, was layered on top of the accumulated observation, and the two things together became the medicine on our stick figure's kitchen counter. The World Health Organization has estimated that close to 80% of the global population still relies primarily on plant-based medicine for their primary health care. Not because they do not know about modern medicine, because that is what is available and because much of it genuinely works. Aspirin from willow bark, morphine from the opium poppy, quinine from the bark of a South American tree used by indigenous peoples for centuries before European scientists arrived and wrote it down. artemisinin, one of the most effective malaria treatments in the modern world, derived from sweet wormwood, a plant used in Chinese medicine for 2,000 years before anyone isolated the active compound. Digoxin, used to treat heart failure, from the foxglove plant. Taxol, one of the most important cancer drugs in modern medicine, from the Pacific yew tree. Vincristine, used to treat childhood leukemia, from the periwinkle flower used in traditional medicine in Madagascar. Modern pharmacology has been mining the ancient pharmacopoeia for decades. Systematically, methodically, with increasingly sophisticated tools, it has been revisiting what ancient healers accumulated through observation and asking, why does this work? And over again, the answer has been, it works because they were right. Our stick figure stands up from the table one final time. He walks to the counter. He picks up the orange pill bottle. He holds it in both hands, in the way that stick figures hold things when the thing in their hands has become more than the thing itself. He turns it over slowly, and now, in his mind, he can see the whole chain at once. The Neanderthal in the cave, chewing bitter bark. The ancient healer, pressing a honey-soaked dressing to a wound. The surgeon in Borneo, 31,000 years ago, making a decision that required more courage than our stick figure can fathom. The stone tools making a clean cut, the patient surviving, the knowledge being passed on, the Egyptian physician writing it down on papyrus, the Greek student reading the papyrus by firelight, the Roman army medic applying it in a field hospital at the edge of the known world, the medieval herbalist tucking the plant cuttings into a pouch for the journey, the folk healer in 18th century England who pressed foxglove leaves into a physician's hands and said, "Try this." The Chinese scholar who documented sweet wormwood not knowing that 2,000 years later it would save millions of lives from malaria. The laboratory technician who isolated the compound. The clinical trial that confirmed it. The regulatory board that approved it. The factory that manufactured it. The pharmacist who dispensed it. All of them in a line. All of them connected. All of them doing the same thing in different languages and different centuries and different degrees of understanding, trying to figure out how to keep a human body alive. Our stick figure sets the bottle down very gently, as if it has become something that should be handled with care. He thinks about what ancient medicine could not do. He is honest about it because the whole story requires honesty. Giving birth was one of the most dangerous things a person could do. Maternal mortality rates in pre-modern societies ranged from roughly 1 to 3% per birth, and women gave birth multiple times. In many ancient societies, half of all children born would not survive to their 5th birthday. Not because people did not care, not because they were not trying, because infections that are now easily treated were then fatal, because diseases that now have vaccines were then unstoppable, because the gap between knowing something helped and knowing why it helped and knowing how to reliably replicate it was a gap that cost lives every single. Our stick figure does not flinch from that. He lets the weight of it sit in his chest for a moment, the weight of all those lives at the edge of a knowledge gap that took thousands of years to close. And then he picks up his coffee, which has gone cold, and he thinks about the people who closed it. Not in a single moment of genius, but incrementally, through trial and error, and loss, and grief, and the stubborn determination to try again tomorrow. Through the kind of courage that does not look like courage from the outside because it looks like someone sitting in a cave grinding plants by firelight while the dark forest breathes outside. That person was doing science. Not the science of controlled experiments and peer review and fluorescent laboratory lighting. The original science. The science of, I noticed something, I tried something, I paid attention to what happened, and I told someone what I learned. It is the same impulse, the same project. Trying to understand the body, trying to keep it alive. The difference between that cave healer and a pharmacologist in a modern research center is not the quality of the thinking. It is the tools, the accumulated knowledge base, and the extraordinary privilege of knowing what a bacterium is. Our stick figure puts his cold coffee down. He looks out the window at a morning that looks the same as it did an hour ago, except that it does not feel the same at all. He looks at his hands. He thinks about Sharon in Missouri, waking up every morning to that electric burning in her fingers, reaching for her medication, rubbing capsaicin cream into her palms. He thinks about the healer who first discovered what that plant could do. He thinks about every hand the knowledge passed through between that healer and Sharon. He thinks about how all of those people across 60,000 years were doing the same thing he is doing right now, waking up, dealing with a body that hurts, and reaching for whatever their time and their place had made available to help. He is not at the beginning of that story. He is not even in the middle. He is standing at the far end of a chain, so long it disappears into the darkness of prehistory, and he is holding the accumulated fruit of everything that came before him. The ibuprofen that took his headache away in 45 minutes is the latest version of a question people have been asking for as long as people have existed. What can we do about this pain? The answer took 50,000 years to fully develop. It traveled through 100,000 hands. It survived plagues and wars, and the burning of libraries, and the deaths of individual healers who took some small piece of it with them, and it made it here. To this kitchen, to this bottle, to this ordinary Tuesday morning. Our stick figure puts his hands flat on the counter. He breathes. And for the first time in his life, he is genuinely, deeply, specifically grateful, not in an abstract way. In the concrete, particular, named way that you can only be grateful for something when you understand exactly what it cost to produce it. He picks up the coffee cup. He takes a sip. Cold coffee tastes better than you expect when you are drinking it with that particular feeling. He sets it down. He looks at the pill bottle one more time, and then he walks to the window. And outside the morning is going on, ordinary and unhurried, full of people going about their lives with their various aches and ailments and bottles of things that help, none of them thinking about where any of it came from. That is fine. That is honestly fine. You do not have to think about it to benefit from it. The chain holds whether you look at it or not. But our stick figure thinks that knowing it is there changes something, not in a grand way, in a quiet, private way. The way that understanding a gift changes how you receive it. He does not know the name of the person who first chewed willow bark and felt their headache ease. Nobody does. That person lived and died without a record. But the thing they discovered is sitting on our stick figure's counter right now, 50,000 years and 1,000 reinventions later, and it works. It still works. And somewhere in that unbroken chain between the cave and the kitchen is every healer who ever paid attention, everyone who ever tried, everyone who ever thought, maybe if I notice carefully enough, maybe if I remember exactly, maybe if I tell someone what I found, it will matter somewhere down the line. It mattered. It all mattered. Every single careful observation, every bitter mouthful of bark, every clean cut made with a stone tool by a surgeon who should not have been possible but was, every careful note made by an Egyptian physician 3,500 years ago, every student who sat in the firelight watching the old healer's hands, it mattered. And it is the reason that our stick figure, this ordinary, small circle and lines person in his ordinary kitchen on his ordinary Tuesday morning, is alive and mostly fine, and slightly annoyed by a headache that is already, quietly, beginning to ease. He smiles. In stick figure terms, this is a small curved line under a circle which is both completely simple and completely sufficient. He finishes his cold coffee. He puts on his jacket. He steps outside into the morning. The chain holds. The story continues. This is your health, your body, your decision. Own it.